Hello and welcome to the Purposeful Banker, the leading commercial banking podcast brought to you by Q2, where we discuss the big topics on the minds of today's best bankers. I'm Dallas Wells. Welcome to the show. Today I'm joined by Lou Senko, Q2's Senior Vice President and Chief Availability Officer. Lou's team is responsible for the availability, performance, and quality of the solutions we deliver, as well as the security and compliance of the environments that those are delivered from, which basically means that Lou is in charge of all things surrounding the hosting of your digital branch: uptime, performance, security, and compliance. About cover it, Lou?
Yeah, that's right, Dallas. Thanks for the intro. It's really one throat to choke, but I have some great partners with both Betham and Blair and Hema around our new CISO, our new Chief Risk Officer, and our new Chief Development Officer. We all have the same stake in delivering quality services.
The reason we wanted to have Lou on is, as you hear from his title and from his background, security and fraud, right? So anytime we walk into a room with a customer, a banker, or a credit union exec, say, all right, what do y'all want to talk about today? Inevitably, one of the top, probably two things on that list is fraud and security. It's top of mind for everybody. And so Lou and his team are in the trenches helping fight the good fight there. And so a few of the credentials up front before we jump in, just so you know who you're listening to here. So Lou's background, he's been a part of high growth global companies. He's done 30 mergers. He's moved, more than 14 times for his career. He's been recognized as CIO of the year in 2019, again in 2022 by a couple different industry organizations. And Lou, your teams are kind of at the forefront of delivering those Q2 critical services to 37 million and growing end users, moving $3.5 trillion of money every year with some really high expectations. You've seen a lot and done a lot. And as I have said a couple times as I do intros, always makes you feel the gray hair a little bit. But anyway, with Lou, welcome to the show and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dallas. And to be clear, it's a wonderful teams that actually do all this great work for us. And I get the privilege of sitting on podcasts like this, talking with folks like yourself about all the great accomplishments they've done.
Yeah. All right. So let's jump into it. So as you just said there, right, Lou has lots of conversations, both with Q2 customers and because Q2 has this kind of award-winning security environment. Lou gets the chance to talk to lots of folks kind of within the digital banking industry and beyond about a lot of the stuff that we're doing here. But recently you were on the stage at our customer conference, Connect 24, talking about fraud. And so typically when you're having these conversations, you're talking about security. And so those two words, they seem synonymous to lots of folks. But why the slight shift? And maybe if you could break down what's the difference between security and fraud and where's the overlap there?
Yeah. Great question. As you said, we've been on stage for the last couple of years talking about security because that was forefront in our customers' mind as cyber and moving to the cloud and different workloads and just being comfortable that we're ahead of those emerging threats and thinking about how, we can spend for 1,400 customers and bring kind of next level solutions to this. And I think the customers and their IT shops and their security shops, their risk and compliance groups got very comfortable with Q2 as a partner. And we try to be very transparent in how we do things. We're not perfect. But we spend a lot of time and energy on this stuff and being very transparent in how we do this. Well, now the topic has shifted to fraud because fraud is on the rise, right? 14% growth year over year, $10 billion of fraud losses last year. Some of the specific things like account takeover up 380% year over year. So these are really prevalent issues that the customers are dealing with. And it's a different part of the customer that it's not the typical security, IT, risk and compliance shops. It's a group inside the business dealing with fraud and answering the calls and working with the end users and covering the losses and trying to understand to make them feel secure with the business relationship, but trying to also then deal with what the real problem is and stopping it. And so as we continue to try to be our customer's best partner, that digital branch is an honor to host, but there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. The customers are asking us to lean in more now on the fraud side of the business, even though most of that fraud is happening outside of Q2. So it's happening with compromise of credentials or an email or a device or something. But the money moved is in Q2. So we've got joint stake here. And so they've asked us to lean in. And when you think about the cyber fraud fusion, it's the way you think about fraud is if something happens and it gets in and it goes and moves money. And when you think about security as far as a breach would go, something happens, they get in, there's a trail of breadcrumbs, and then they go do a crime. And then it's not just about catching that crime and killing that crime, but following the breadcrumbs back up and trying to follow this kind of kill chain thinking about, well, how far up could I have stopped this and what else can I do differently? And that's the way security thinks. And security has a lot of hygiene and a lot of things like compliance and regulations and certifications that they do to be really good at their craft. Well, we can bring all that same thinking to fraud now. So there's a technology play there. There's a hygiene and process play. There's a people and skills play. And so bringing the security and fraud together in that kind of cyber fraud fusion is the next hill to climb here as we tackle fraud.
Yeah, as you were describing that, it kind of made me think of just the evolution of the industry. Once upon a time, the security was a little easier to wrap your mind around, right? It was literally the vault door for a long time. And then once we did start building some systems, they were all kind of like on-prem, and you could build this strong perimeter, and there weren't a lot of pipes going in and out. You could contain that pretty well. But as we've moved toward this much more open finance approach, and like that's an inevitability, right? That's not a trend that any financial institution out there can fight against, nor do their customers want them to. But as we've had to kind of open that perimeter to offer so many kind of valuable services, it's made this much harder. That's interesting that now your team goes from kind of defending the wall, now kind of operating on both sides, right? Because the fraud's happening all over the place.
Well, and when you think about infrastructure, it used to be physical things, and now it's really software. And so that's really blended into the application, and it's all just software. You think about protecting the money used to be from a breach into the infrastructure. Well, I won't say we have that covered, but we've done a lot of work there. Yeah. So now the easiest path is misuse of the application. So steal someone's login and password is much easier than trying to get through the 25 layers of defense we have around an infrastructure attack.
Yeah. And so one of the elements we've talked about on this podcast a couple times is, even though the fraud has gotten much more sophisticated, there's much more of a technological bent to it, it's still a human element. The weak point is still like the human beings using that. So as you talk about that, right, the stealing somebody's username and password, that's rarely, or at least not as often, like a hacker in a hoodie, right? Like cracking somebody's password. It's usually some form of social engineering, or somebody's got a password taped to a keyboard, or those very simple kind of things that then allow them to bypass all the millions of dollars worth of things that you all put in place.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned there some of the trends in fraud losses. What are some of the biggest culprits there, especially when we look at kind of the commercial angle of it? Where do we see the big exposures for financial institutions?
Yeah, the two big ones, and there's really kind of probably six that are, if I think about all the categories, there's probably six categories. The two big ones are account takeover, meaning someone is impersonating that person with a login and password and how they get by your multi-factor and all that stuff. The other one is account opening. Opening accounts, it's deemed now that 25% of those are for fraudulent purposes. And we got really good during COVID when all the branches were moving all the services to online. Opening accounts now is the thing. But then you have your typical check fraud, your credit card fraud is, kind of an evergreen standing to that happen. And then dealing with instant payments, and that's not so much commercial, that's more the retail side of the thing, but instant payments become a real challenge because, again, me paying my neighbor's kid $10 for mowing the lawn, that's a very difficult transaction to understand. Is this normal? And there's no payment history, and we don't really know the two endpoints. And it becomes much more of a very difficult needle in a stack of needles to understand if that one's legitimate or not. So the fraud, normally that's small dollars. On the commercial side, it's really about people getting in and then moving big chunks of money in ways that are trying to defeat what abnormal looks like.
You touched on a little bit there, though, like the instant payments, all the P2P services that are out there. And what we end up with is sort of this daisy chain of payment processors and providers and different rails. And so the risk that financial institutions got, frankly, pretty good at managing was things like wires, right? Like once a wire is gone, the pattern was it's gone and then it scatters really quickly. This ecosystem that we have now is kind of like scattered by nature. So once that money does leave, it's really hard to track. And that's the interesting balance that I think financial institutions have to face is that ability to quickly get that money out with as little friction as possible. Like that's the point. That's the products that people are asking for. But then those are the most susceptible to fraud and the hardest to track down. So it's not just that there's instances of fraud, but that the loss rates on that fraud are really high because it's hard to ever recoup it. So with those sort of challenges, what do banks and credit unions do about this? So as you're talking to customers and they're like, look, fraud's up, feel like we got to offer these things. We feel like we're kind of fighting an uphill battle. Like, what are some of the tangible things that we can try to put in place?
Well, again, great question. Almost 50% of financial institutions are implementing some sort of new technology to go fight fraud. And if you're like me, you're waking up every morning, there's 5 new emails from companies you never heard of, which what sounds like pretty interesting solutions to kind of new fraud angles, new fraud surfaces. Yeah. And the challenge is to sort through all that and figure out which ones are keepers, which ones are actually really have some muster here, which ones are different. The stats show about 2/3 of the financial institutions that have 5 billion or more under assets are implementing technologies that use things like machine learning and AI. The proof is in the pudding here in that those folks that used AI, only 28% of them saw a significant increase in fraud or fraud losses compared to ones who didn't, 38% of those saw it. So there's a marked difference in what those solutions were able to do for folks that successfully implemented them. So when you think about Q2's approach of how we can help our financial institutions find the right solution for them, the right third-party vendors to partner with and solve these problems, make some bets, but be flexible in that they can take advantage and stay agile. And if the market changes, new threats come on board, they can kind of adopt that and drop the old ones and change. So we want to really empower choice. When you think about Q2's position here with 1,400 customers, we have a $200 million credit union and we have a $200 billion commercial bank. Yeah. And for us to create a solution that would be the right solution for all those different use cases is impossible, right? So rather than kind of force a one solution trying to cover all these different surfaces, what we wanted to do is really provide a place where they could use the power of our platform, but leverage this huge ecosystem of fraud tech. And that fraud tech ecosystem every day is just growing bigger and wider and new things coming. And I'm sure in 6 months it'll look very different. So the way we're trying to do that is really bring them into this kind of marketplace concept that we've been very successful at, bringing different solutions available to our financial institutions, yet fill them with fraud tech, different ones to solve different problems, right? Solve the check problem, solve the account opening problem, solve the account takeover problem. And there's different philosophies and different technologies that are used in different vendors. And what we want is our customers to get comfortable with the vendor of their choice and the solutions that make sense to them, the way this technology works, the way once they find that one, again, like the typical marketplace experience, it's an app store, you click on it, you boom, and it becomes pre-integrated and pre-wired into the Q2 platform. So that then reduces this friction around, okay, now I bought this solution. Either it has to operate separately from Q2 and the rest of it, and I have to find ways to get the information in, make decisions, and somehow real-time interact with the transaction in flight, or I could leverage this power of this platform where things are already pre-integrated, pre-wired, and pre-go. And so the way we're thinking about this then is basically offer all the Q2 products are creating signals around the user, around the transaction, around the endpoint, around the things that they're doing on the platform, behaviors, traits that they have. Those signals are going into an orchestration hub. And then we're all going to open up that hub to allow third parties to those solutions to plug into that same hub. So basically, this hub then is the one place where your employees, the financial institution employees, go to set up the decisions. Hey, signals, this risk rating is, let me know about. This risk rating is low enough, let it go through. This risk rating is dangerous enough, I want you to block it. So as all the different third parties come up with their own different ways of coming up with a risk statement, that goes into the hub. And then the hub, you have one place where you can create the decisions, one place where you can work the cases. Out of that comes then this ability to say, okay, I've got the signals from the various pieces. I've made a decision. I'm then going to either block it, allow it, or cause an interdiction. And that interdiction can be things like have them MFA again, have step up, have a dual multi-factor authentication. I can do a bunch of different things just to go from this warning to this block, right? Take the best of the solutions that meet your needs today. If in 6 months there's new ones, you can plug them in, you can dump other ones, and it doesn't change where you're working. You work in the hub. And so it creates, last thing we want to do is have people have to log into 20 different solutions, try to orchestrate commonality between them. The complexity becomes its own security problem. This way, it all comes to one spot, you work in one spot, and you can plug and play with the third parties as you want.
Yeah.
Big long answer to it was a simple question.
There's a couple threads I'd love to pull on there. So first of all, that concept of a platform approach, right? And kind of opening that up to the broader ecosystem. So I think as you said, we've seen great success kind of across the rest of the platform with that concept. We're doing the same thing on go forward strategy around data too, right? Like it's got to be accessible. It's got to be in a place where you can sort of extend it to the rest of your business and make use of it. And for fraud in particular, that surface area has gotten so broad that a lot of financial institutions were finding themselves like, I've got 25 different point solutions. This one for this kind of check fraud, and this one for dispute tracking, and this one for now Zelle fraud. And so like, there's got to be some place for us to consolidate that. One interesting thing that's come up as a part of headlines, though, this mess with Synapse and Evolve. And that's just like, one of the latest ones. There's these sorts of things all the time of a data breach and some maybe playing a little bit loose from some of the fintechs, right?
Yep.
That they're sort of in the banking ecosystem and sort of under the regulatory scrutiny, but not exactly the same as the banks and credit unions are. That's a tricky thing for especially a smaller institution with some limited resources to try to navigate. So I know both of us have some of these conversations with our customers where they're like, look, how do I know who to trust and who not to? Can you talk about that a little bit of like, what's the right way to approach? Like, yeah, we need that sophistication. We need that breadth of tools. How do we not get scared of the weak link in the chain there?
Yeah, another great question. And it is a dichotomy of trying to figure out the right solutions and the innovation that needs to happen at the speed of innovation, yet manage risk. And all companies are looking for ways to be more efficient. And that typically means global talent. And so or third parties help you do a thing that you used to do. They can do it better or cheaper. That third party could be in a different country than you are. And the data is everywhere, right? And as much as we do our due diligence, and much as we try to understand it, I think everybody, as you know, there's a new one in the headlines every day. Everybody's susceptible to nation state actors. Everyone's susceptible to a change management issue. We have a lot of process, we have a lot of technology, we have a lot of people, but there's still opportunity for mistakes. And then once that data is out and someone's got an account login and a password, and they get creative with social engineering to get the multi-factor codes and how they do that. Sometimes it's super technical how they steal the token. Sometimes it's so simple they just talk to a person on the phone and trick them, right? So what we end up doing is just expecting the fact that's out there and that's going to happen. And it's no different than the way we treat phishing emails. Our company trains our employees not to click on those emails, and we test them all the time. Random samples, very well-crafted emails. And we're so happy when only 6 people clicked it. That was still
so 6 exposures. Yeah.
All it took is 1, right? And so we've got to expect that whatever we do is not going to be perfect, and someone's going to try something. And that's where these tools then matter, right? So our solutions and the signals, the third parties that have some unique ways to define that. And so sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's behavioral. They're just doing something not quite normal for this user, and that could be a risk signal, right? But the way you kind of define your strategy around what are the types of frauds we're seeing, what are the things that we're least protected against, how can we create this ecosystem of partners, of different building blocks to kind of plug the holes and gaps that we have. And you can't do everything at once. So you got to take the most obvious things first, put the puzzle together with the different pieces, try it out. If it doesn't work, you can swap these things in and out. And that's the whole beauty of this kind of marketplace extensibility thing, right? And so
good point.
We encourage great hygiene, due diligence, but we know that whatever we do, no one in the chain is perfect, and everyone is going to experience one of these breaches eventually. And so when that happens, just knowing that all that information is out there to be used against us when the next time someone tries to log in. We just have to expect it. That's where these kind of tools will help.
Yeah. So if I can say that back to you, maybe it's like across, like in our case, right? Tens of millions of users, billions of logins, trillions of dollars of money movement. Like the math says, no matter how good you are, there is exposure there across some part of that ecosystem. And so I think the right approach is to, one, expect it to happen. And two, we try to limit the severity, right? Part of the messiness of that particular evolved data breach wasn't that there was a data breach. It was that they had in like plain text files, all the PII all together in one spot.
Right.
Those are the things, that's what the due diligence is for, right? Is make sure that isn't how they're handling some of that information. And those are the things that like we try to help with, right? Is some of that diligence around, we know the questions to ask and where there might be some red flags. And if we come across a partner that is not up to standards, as you said, it gets swapped out, right? For another provider. So I think that kind of then leads to the other thread I wanted to pull on there, which is given that we know it's going to happen, and even if we try to limit it, what we then look for is changes in that behavior pattern. So we look for anomalies. And that's something that used to it was a human being looking through transaction reports. And now that's something that is much more automated. And that's where the machine learning and AI starts to really make a difference. And for all the excitement and, in all honesty, maybe parlor tricks that we see around AI these days, this is the real use cases, right? This is the places where we're actually seeing financial institutions like buy real production ready tools, put them in place, and actually start to see some real savings. Can you talk about any, and you don't have to name names, but maybe any just conceptually, some of the things that you're seeing there that are like in place and working in the real world?
To your point, the technology is fantastic. When you think about, there's 34,000 logins to a Q2 product every minute. Yeah. And to be able to real time take that login and then understand that user, what they're doing on the platform is normal or not normal, and then to risk grade it and interdict that transaction in real time at 34,000 logins is pretty cool. There's some really cool technology underneath that makes that all possible. But some of the ways we're seeing third parties help solve this problem is looking at the endpoint and going, look, this is normal for this user to behave this way. If they start acting abnormal, and that's on our platform and off of our platform, if it's not normal, then the risk of that is obviously much higher. Q2 does a bunch of things internally with the user in the session and the transaction, and we try to determine, is this normal behavior for this user? And if not, we change the risk rating as well. If they do something that is maybe not about a transaction, but it's a high risk event. For example, changing the target for secure access codes. That's a high risk event. Maybe that's something we should care about. In concert with other changes, maybe that increases the risk of what that user is doing. We have folks that have done some really cool things around MFA where, hey, even if you get my login and you get my password and you figured out some way to get the SAC code, and so you've answered the three things that should let you get in. If it's not coming from the device that I personally registered, it won't pass. And so those kind of things, when you think about, hey, that really helps lock down even the ones where, and I hate to say this, but 48% of the fraud is targeted at the 60 plus age group, and they amount for 72% of the losses. So they have the money, and they also are maybe least sophisticated with technology. And so this becomes the surface that gets exposed the most. If you can find solutions that allow you to be sloppy and it still doesn't get you what you want, that's really the coup de grace there.
This is a topic we've covered here before too, but that there becomes a user experience, kind of a customer experience element to this as well, right? So we're adding some friction, and especially for that particular cohort, right? But we're maybe not all that technically savvy. So we have to find the right ways to put that friction in place. This is one of those things where the financial institutions that we see do this well, kind of in that last mile, you've kind of escalated all the friction up. They're still trying to do the transaction. Eventually, you might just have to have a human being call that human being, verbally talk through it, verify, do what you can to then help them complete that if it's really them, or help stop the fraud if that's not the case. But it's one of those things that there's only so much efficiency we can kind of squeeze out of digital if you want to do it right. And that includes this kind of fraud and security element. So I just think that's an interesting twist as we try to move all things digital, but there's still at the end comes a point where it's like we may have to have some like people intervene here to make this go right.
Right.
Let's get maybe one more question in here. Let's just have you switch sides of the table and maybe put yourself in a bank or a credit union executive's shoes. New job, and now you're in charge of, for a bank or a credit union, these same topics. Kind of what's your starting point? What do you do to tackle fraud and security? What's the basic elements that you want to make sure are in place? And maybe what's the pecking order of those few things of like, these are the things I know I got to quickly get my arms around and make sure are in place.
Yeah. Great. Again, great question. You think about building kind of a roadmap of what good looks like. We're never there, right? We're always someplace else. And then we build our roadmap to get to where we want to be. And it's all about just allowing intentional choices. You can't solve it all tomorrow, but you build on. It's a capabilities thing that you're trying to enable, that then you empower it with technology, processes, and people and staff and roles, right? And so this is, the way we solve any sort of these business type problems. In the fraud space, because it's still emerging and there's changes happening all the time, we want to make sure that our choices don't pigeonhole us into commitments that become irrelevant pretty quickly and we can change. And so this ability to kind of, hey, we're a vendor for 6 months because it was the right choice at the time, but then there's a new surface happening and we want to change that out to this new capability.
Yeah.
That plug and play and in and out and adding new vendors that maybe do one thing really well, but it doesn't do all the other things. So when you have to make a choice, you go, well, I don't have to make a choice. I can just add them and add that capability. And in a year, if that's no longer a need, I can unplug it. And this kind of building block architecture is really, I think, a key strategy because it doesn't force you into having to make commitments that you wish you could undo as you get more information or the things around this, the criteria around making that decision changes over time.
Yeah. So that's interesting because I think bankers are used to, in most of their business, reacting to cycles, right? Credit cycles change, interest rate cycles change, you morph accordingly. And so you try to not pour concrete around one particular strategy because you may need to very quickly adjust as things change around you. But in terms of fraud and security, that hasn't always been the case, right? It's like, well, this is our vendor and it's who we've used for the last 20 years. And so like whatever they have is what we have. And so I like that idea of maybe approaching it in a way where not everything has to be like a heart transplant if you want to swap things around. It's got to be a little more modular, a little more nimble, which is interesting.
To your point, I think the IT capabilities were like infrastructure, were like the building. And so you kind of built it once and then, everything ran on it. And that's not the way we think about it anymore. We want to think about it more as very solution focused. And so there's a particular solution we need, a problem we have, a solution we need. We enable that. And then, the problem changes, goes away. More, we can change our solution to it. And again, it's about the power of extending and taking on options, not waiting on Q2 to think of every option, but Q2 as the ability to empower you for your choice.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we'll wrap it there, Lou. I appreciate you making the time for this today, and given the relevance of this topic, I doubt it's our last conversation on it. So thanks for joining.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Del.
All right. And that's it for this week's episode of The Purposeful Banker. If you want to catch more episodes, please subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. Let us know what you think in the comments, and you can learn more about the company behind the content by visiting q2.com. Until next time, this is Dallas Wells, and you've been listening to The Purposeful Banker.